McLaren's return to race-winning ways and a year-long fight against a rejuvenated Ferrari made it very easy to forget the big restrictions it had to work with in 2021. Last year, McLaren returned to being a Mercedes engine customer after 3 awful years with Honda and 3 transitional seasons with Renault. Because F1 delayed its new technical rules to 2022, the 2020 cars were rolled over for 2021 to keep costs down amid the coronavirus pandemic, and a token system was implemented to control development. And in that unusual environment, McLaren had a unique challenge. It was the only team changing engines and had to adapt its MCL35 to accommodate the Mercedes power unit, having optimised it around the Renault design. But McLaren had to forfeit its development tokens in exchange for permission to do that, and it had to agree to only complete the minimum work required to make the change possible. This was a significant issue when it was being discussed in 2020, and McLaren made it clear it led to a massive amount of work over the winter. Technical Director James Key still reflects on it with a mix of annoyance and understanding, as he says there would have been things we did differently if McLaren had its development tokens available. He said at the end of 2021, "We would love to have had the token spend. It always seemed a little bit unfortunate that we had to spend on engine installation as a lot of components had to change." So what happened with those forgotten restrictions, and why exactly did we all pretty much forget about them? The restrictions around McLaren's move to Mercedes compromised the team in 2 key ways. The first was in the installation of the Mercedes engine itself, for which McLaren had to err on the side of caution. It's worth acknowledging that integrating the new power unit was no easy task given the restrictions the world was operating under thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic at the point the process started in earnest. Closing factories meant 2 things: that engineers from McLaren and Mercedes were not meeting in person, standing around a dyno or examining physical products and spaces, and that the process started late while both sides waited for both the UK government lockdown and the F1 imposed shutdown to end. Once the integration started properly, McLaren had tighter rules to follow than are usually associated with adapting a car to a new engine. To ensure McLaren did not make any changes to gain further performance, it had to organise regular CAD design reviews with the FIA and satisfy that its proposed changes were the minimum necessary to facilitate the new engine. Key said the engine installation would have been a bit different had we had the normal freedoms you get. We had to put a Mercedes in a car that was meant for a Renault engine. That's what the FIA wanted to see. We wouldn't have done that. We would have put it in a car designed for a Mercedes. So there were a few compromises. Working out how compatible a chassis will be with a new engine involves an element of guesswork. The heat rejection numbers from the previous car are of limited value, because McLaren didn't know how its design would cope with the Mercedes package, and likewise Mercedes had no reference for McLaren's cooling systems. The lack of certainty over whether the McLaren would be equivalent to the Mercedes works team or its existing customers prompted caution. Big bulky changes included elements like the cooling layout and the fact the Mercedes power unit has a split turbo and compressor, which led to a slight increase in the length of the car. That's because it impacts fundamental design elements like the gearbox, packaging space for the rear suspension, and the chassis' air inlet system. Knock-on impacts from these areas would have required a token spend to address, so McLaren had to minimise the impact the changes had on the car. Fortunately for McLaren, the physical installation of the Mercedes engine was quite straightforward. Key described the Mercedes design as a really tidy piece of engineering and a really racy package. That basically means it's compact, there's no large bits of machinery sticking out or big wiring looms and other things to try and accommodate. But unsurprisingly, McLaren admits that it could have pushed the collaboration harder than it did in the first year. Key said the reality is we would have done a few things differently, but we had to try and take a car designed around a different power unit and squeeze a Mercedes into the same space, which was pretty tough. We're going to pause the video quickly to ask a quick favour. If you're enjoying this video, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. It really helps us out, and we've got loads planned for 2022, which you're not going to want to miss out on. The second compromised area was McLaren's wider development options, as the team had to alter its development schedule in 2020 and later had other ideas that it wasn't able to pursue. The token system worked by assigning different components different homologation dates. For instance, several chassis and gearbox components were frozen from the first practice session of 2020, while suspension elements were frozen weeks later. This meant teams could still update certain parts of the car before the 2021 season began, but others would be stuck in their 2020 specification if not changed by a late 2020 date. McLaren's issue is that it would not have had the tokens to use to overcome one of these homologation deadlines. Key said there's probably a few areas we would have attacked again. Maybe another round of front suspension, maybe a little bit on the rear mechanically. But McLaren had hit key developments hard in 2020 in anticipation of this. Ahead of a late 2020 homologation deadline, it introduced a modified, narrower nose and front suspension tweaks that would have been impossible to do without spending tokens it didn't have had they been done later. This was vital in limiting any major impact in 2021. And the upshot is Key reckons the lack of tokens didn't put McLaren at a massive disadvantage because the concept they wanted on the 21 car they tried to put on in 2020 at the end. So in large part down to the team's proactivity, the lack of a token spend never became a defining element of McLaren's season. And the reality is that the real risk of the restrictions hurting McLaren's performance was not in terms of wider development, but specifically the limitations around adapting to the Mercedes in the first place, which we've already outlined. And Key admits that those challenges that came with the circumstances under which McLaren had to try to install the engine was probably the most difficult bit. After all this, McLaren had a strong package over the balance of the 2021 season, even though some car limitations remained. The Mercedes power unit played its part in continuing the team's upward trajectory. Even in a compromised form, it came with a performance advantage, especially as Renault opted for a conservative strategy and didn't develop its engine for 2021. That means even though the relationship started with a tricky challenge, McLaren's switch was undeniably justified. Missing out on third place in the championship was disappointing, especially given its 17.5 point lead over Ferrari turned to a 48.5 point deficit over the final 7 races. But even so, McLaren was satisfied with its progress relative to the front of the field, which was borne out by its performance deficit reducing from just under 1.4% in 2020 to just over 0.9% in 2021. That wouldn't have been possible had McLaren started the year on the back foot with its new power unit and shown signs of a compromised engine and chassis package. Instead, towards the end of the 2021 season, McLaren team boss Andreas Seidel was able to pay tribute to a sensational job by McLaren and Mercedes to integrate the new power unit. He said, "We were really ready from the first test onwards without any reliability issues, which is a great result, and I think the results we could score this year speak for themselves." It's hard to disagree with that. Given McLaren won in Italy, took pole in Russia and scored other podium finishes, it certainly hit the ground running with a new partnership that McLaren does ultimately believe can lead to winning world championships in the future. And that's ultimately why its big 2021 restrictions were so easily forgotten.